All right, so just to introduce Dr. Cotter here once again, is a man of many certifications and degrees and whatnot. I'll give you guys a couple here. He has a doctorate in health and exercise science. He's an associate professor of exercise physiology. I actually had him for physiology. I think it was this past year. He's also the founder and co-director of the PEX lab on campus. That's the physiology of exercise and sport lab. And as you can see in his list of other certifications, it's many other things, but I'll let you take the floor here.
Well, thanks very much for having me here. I'm very happy always to be a speaker for the Exercises Medicine, since it's very dear to my heart, and I'm current director of it. And I've seen the student organization do many great things as you are continuing with that trend this year. And when I was invited to give a talk on this particular topic, which I came up with the title from REM, which is rapid eye movement, from REM to reps, the connection between sleep, exercise, and hormones, I thought it would be really interesting. I do want to note that I am not an expert on sleep, nor did I really find a lot of great information on it when I was preparing for this talk. And so that was quite interesting and something I really wasn't expecting. But given how mysterious sleep really is, and there's a lot we don't know about sleep, I'm actually not that surprised anymore that there's not a lot of great research out there, because there's so many if you look at sleep, exercise, and hormones, those are all really big areas with a lot of variation, a lot of breadth, and a lot of depth to each one of them. So combining them all together can be really difficult. With that being said, hopefully I'll give you some information today that will give you a little insight into maybe how these interact with each other, and at the very least might give you some ideas about the importance of sleep and exercise together. So yeah, let's go ahead and get to it. If you feel that it's pertinent to stop me at any point, let's go ahead and do it. We can keep this pretty informal. I'll ask some questions along the way. Otherwise, I'll have question and answer at the end as well. So sleep, I'm going to focus mostly on sleep because I think that was the most interesting topic to discuss. And then below that is exercise, and then below that is hormones, and you'll see the reason why when I get to it. But sleep, what is the big deal? Well, let's talk about a few things relating to sleep. The National Sleep Foundation recommends 7 to 9 hours of sleep for adults. And for older adults, that goes down a little bit. I think it's 7 to 8 hours of sleep. And through the various time periods of development before adulthood, before 18 years of age, there are different recommendations for the different ages there. So a lot more sleep, for instance, for my 4-year-old son than what we need as adults. Now, something to think about is how many people are actually getting 7 to 9 hours of sleep. I can tell you, for me personally, I've always struggled with sleep for quite some time, until actually this last year. My sleep is better, and we might get into that towards the end and why that might be, but I'm consistently getting that, and I've made several changes to my sleep habits that have really helped with that. And I'm going to provide some tips at the end to hopefully get you on the same page with that as well. But to answer the question, how many of us are getting that? It's greater than 1/3 of Americans don't meet this recommendation. 5 to 15% of Americans suffer from insomnia, and 1/3 of Americans report 3+ awakenings per night. Even though I'm sleeping much better, I definitely know I wake up more than 3 times a night. And waking up at night's not that big of a deal. It's completely normal. And it's especially not a big deal if it doesn't bother your overall sleep for the night. And for me, it doesn't. I just wake up, I turn over, and I fall back asleep. But that's not the case for many individuals. And that might be the case for you, where you wake up, your mind flips on, and you start thinking about things, and it might be hours later until you get back to sleep. For those individuals, that's a problem. And lastly, poor sleep results in, this is a big one, increased risk for cardiovascular disease, stroke, depression, and anxiety, and mortality. Yes, death. So if you have poor sleep, you have an increased risk for your mortality, for dying. That's not something any of us wants. So it's important that we have good sleep and good sleep habits. There were a lot of references that went into this page, and it would have made it very cluttered. So if anyone's interested in anything specific here, shoot me an email and I will provide you those references there. So again, another disclaimer, not only am I not an expert on sleep, but I can tell you there is much we don't know about sleep yet. For instance, what is the optimal amount of time for each sleep stage? We're not going to get into direct sleep stages with the amount of time that we have today, but I think there's still a lot unknown about that. You know, how many hours of deep sleep do we need? How many hours of REM sleep do we need? It's not like set in stone yet, and it's probably different from an individual to individual basis. What is the importance of each sleep stage? We do know a lot more about that, but there's still a lot we don't understand. You know, think about dream states as well. They're pretty mysterious. You know, what is the importance for dream states? How variable are the sleep needs from person to person? I think that's a really big one that needs a lot more attention. Not everyone needs the same amount of sleep, for instance. For me, based on, you know, my own observations of how I function and how I feel, I'm pretty good with on the lower end about 7 hours of sleep. My wife, on the other hand, really needs 9 and maybe even 10 hours of sleep, to be perfectly honest, for her to at least subjectively feel like she's well rested and ready to tackle the day. So why is that, right? I don't think we really have a good idea of why that is. And at the end of the day, what is a good night's sleep? We're all looking for a good night's sleep, but what does that mean? You know, some individuals, I was reading some research, have really nice levels of deep sleep at night, but they wake up and they feel a little bit groggy. And that's because having that increased deep sleep can delay or decrease your increase in cortisol that we usually see in the morning. And until that happens, you often feel a little bit groggy. But was that deep sleep good and beneficial? Yeah, it probably was. So that subjective feeling of grogginess in the morning might not really represent truly what was a good night's sleep for you. So there's so many variables for us to think about that goes into what really is that good night's sleep for us. So keep that in mind as we're going on all through this talk, is sleep is a very hazy area. We know a lot about, but there's a lot more for us to learn about. So in general, since we're talking about physical activity and exercise, healthy living really requires physical activity and good sleep, right? So what is healthy living? Uh, let's go through some things I think are important for healthy living. This is not all inclusive, but managing stress. You guys are all in a university environment. It is stressful. I remember. It's been a while, but I remember. And managing stress is important for your health. Just subjectively, again, feeling good is important. Being able to perform activities of daily living, something that becomes more and more important as we age, when we have more difficulties performing activities of daily living. Big one, reducing disease risk. Also, again, seems to become more important the older we get when things start not working as they used to, but important for you to start thinking about earlier in life. And if you do get a disease, being able to manage disease symptoms with good sleep and adequate levels of physical activity. I'm going to touch on this one today too, is improving mental health. And I'm glad that was brought up earlier with the presentation on the student health services available at Long Beach. And I have a quick question, since the third tier, the lowest tier of what I'm going to talk about today is hormones. I'm just curious for those in attendance here, what hormone do you generally think of when we talk about stress? Does anyone have an idea of what the quote unquote stress hormone is, or do you remember?
I believe it's cortisol.
Right. I was on mute. I was going to say either chat or you can chime in with the microphone. We don't have a huge gathering here today, so we can, you know, make it a little informal with the microphone. But Giovanni, yeah, you're right. Cortisol. And that's the first one we're really going to talk about. And depending on what classes you've had or what in depth you've went into, basically we have the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, or the HPA axis, which is how cortisol really works, where we have you know, sensing of a stressful situation, which will signal the hypothalamus to release cortico releasing hormone. It's going to release another hormone, ACTH, by the pituitary gland. And finally, we're going to end up with cortisol from the adrenal gland. And we'll have further measuring of cortisol in the body by the pituitary gland and hypothalamus to kind of keep this system in check and continuing producing cortisol if we need it, or perhaps stopping that system from occurring if things are reducing back to normal and the stress is being reduced. So this is quite a complex situation that can have many different variations, and what the final response will be, that's not going to be the focus here, but for us, the focus is going to be on that production of cortisol. What does that do to the body? How does that affect sleep? And how does physical activity interact with that? So cortisol is very interesting from the standpoint of, we do know pretty well about the circadian rhythm of cortisol, and that is the 24-hour fluctuation of cortisol. And you'll see a nice representation of that here. If you look at the x-axis, you have clock time. So 1 is 1 in the morning, 2, 3, 4, 5 in the morning. And you can see what happens is as we start to awake in the morning around 5, 6, 7 a.m. for most individuals, you see this very, very sharp rise in cortisol, where we have the peak cortisol sometime early to mid-morning. And then you have a general decline throughout the day into the evening, and you see a decreased level of cortisol generally at night, and you rinse and repeat every day. Now, there's differences that can happen with cortisol. In a stressful time period, you might have increased levels of cortisol here in the morning, and you might have difficulty in reducing cortisol levels to what they need to be into the evening. Or perhaps you have something going on in the evening that spikes your cortisol up more than it should, and that could have an effect on your sleep patterns too. And again, we'll get into that. Actually, we'll get into it here a little bit on the next slide. Okay, I'm really sorry. I am going to be presenting several slides of information that were taken from systematic reviews or meta-analysis, and they often provide charts like this. But really, it's not that complicated, and I'll tell you why here. It's because we're really just going to be looking at the figure part. These are called forest plots, and we're just going to be looking at what's happening on the right here. These are really awesome because they take into consideration data from multiple studies that are looked at for certain specifications to be included in their study, and they come up with some conclusions. And that's great. It's because we can see what's happening across all kinds of studies. And this first one at the top is looking at a cortisol outcome with exercise included. So there's a control group, which is no exercise, and an experimental here, which is an exercise group. And you can see that in general, all of these research studies favor exercise as being able to reduce overall cortisol levels. As Giovanni said, cortisol is a stress hormone. So if we have less cortisol around, we're having less of a stressful physiological response to whatever it is that we're experiencing. And you can see this was quite nice and consistent across the board to various levels, because studies are designed a little bit different. But in general, and you can see that represented by the diamond, that exercise does seem to favor a decrease in cortisol levels overall. Now look below that, the studies that they looked at give them some insight into sleep outcome with exercise. This is just looking at exercise and the effect on sleep outcome. And this was from the PSQI, the Pittsburgh Sleep Quality Index. I've never taken that. I was unfamiliar with it, but if you type that into Google, I think there's a PDF of it, which is the first result. So you can actually look at what that is. You'll see that it's quite a nice survey that factors in many different variables that gives you a final outcome of sleep quality, if you will. And that's what was looked at here. And you can see that exercise too seems to give us a favorable result on sleep quality. Now, what they did also look at was there a correlation between cortisol changes and quality and sleep changes? And actually, there was not really that much correlation around, which I thought was very, very interesting. So is there something with physical activity and exercise that improves sleep quality that is unrelated to the stress hormone? It appears to be that's the case. And that's not something that we know very well. So that was kind of the first ding with exercise, sleep, and hormones, was that even though there is a favorable response on cortisol, and maybe that does things like increase our mood during the day, which could have like a secondary positive outcome on sleep, it doesn't look like there might be a direct positive effect on cortisol, that's directly affecting sleep there, at least. And I'll put up the conclusion here that they had. They said small beneficial effects of physical exercise to decrease cortisol levels and improve sleep outcomes in adults was the result of this systematic review. So it's kind of like physical activity is doing great things with cortisol. It's doing great things with sleep, but it doesn't necessarily mean that the effect on cortisol is the one that's causing the improvement in sleep. Okay. Now, I had to dig a little bit deeper, and you can see this study is way back from 1995, and hence you'll see a little bit more of the graininess of the figures. That is just the way they were back then. I mean, it's kind of interesting to go back to see how much improvement we've had in technology, but nevertheless, they had some really interesting data here. And again, I had to really search for this. It was hard for me to find data. And they looked at the 3 hormones that you might have originally thought I might discuss, right? I'm sure many of you thought of cortisol, but others might have thought also growth hormone and testosterone. These are ones that are frequently discussed about when we talk about exercise, but also when we separately talk about sleep as well. Now, this study was kind of interesting. They took triathletes and they separated the activity that we're doing into, and I had to look at this. They didn't word it very well, but you can see here they talk about long duration, low intensity, and long duration, moderate intensity. Where they get moderate and intense for the subheadings here, I'm not so sure, but the moderate is really long duration, low intensity. But get this, it's 40 kilometers of cycling. That's 24 miles. I had to do the conversion. I don't know kilometer to miles in the back of my head. I probably should. Or long duration, moderate intensity. That's 120 to 150 kilometers cycling. That is 75 to 93 miles. That's no joke. I used to like cycling, and I wasn't cycling like that. 24 miles was a nice, difficult ride for me. I'm no endurance athlete. I think if you guys that know me know I'm no endurance athlete. So it's no joke here, right? So even the low intensity, long duration is pretty crazy in my view, at least. So let's look to see what the result is. You can kind of see very easily here that there was definitely, oh, what are these bars? So the black bars were before exercise. The hash bars, I don't know, the diagonal bars there. Oh, I might need to look here. What was the diagonal bars? Something like 15 minutes into exercise, I think it was. And then the one that we're really interested in are the dotted bars, though that is immediately after exercise. Okay, yeah, after 15 minutes of exercise. I got it right. And you can see with the lower intensity exercise, not really that much difference with cortisol, but check out the really long duration moderate intensity. Look what it did with cortisol there after exercise. That's a huge increase, almost double the amount, more than double the amount than what they have at rest. And look, kind of a little bit similar with growth hormone. Any exercise seemed to have a little bit of an effect on growth hormone. It didn't look like this one was significant at the long duration, low intensity, but it was significant at the higher intensity. And look at the effect on testosterone, which is really interesting. Really no effect on testosterone from the low intensity, but there was actually a decrease in testosterone with the higher intensity exercise for the very, very long duration of 75 to 93 miles. So there is an effect on hormones, but what was really interesting is they then looked at how does that exercise bout, and if I remember correctly, that was all those exercise bouts were done in the evening, so it was fairly close to bedtime. And they then looked at these hormones overnight, and I'll show you an additional figure here that shows you more, hour to hour how that looks. You can see no difference on cortisol at night. There was no difference in growth hormone at night, although it looks like a trend to a lower growth hormone production with the lower intensity exercise, but not significant. But where you can see a difference is that in those that exercised, there was lower testosterone at night. And that's interesting. Did that affect sleep quality or anything like that? I don't think they measured that in this particular study. That would have been interesting to know. But what they did kind of conclude is that maybe there's a lower anabolic recovery potential at night as you progress from a lower intensity type exercise to a moderate to high intensity exercise, and what kind of effect might that have over time? I'm not sure that study's been done, but it is something to think about. I didn't really build it into this discussion here today, but I will tell you there's kind of two camps out there on at least in regards to hormones and their effect in relation to how they're changed after exercise. In other words, if exercise changes hormones, how big of a deal does that really matter with the phenotypic adaptations you're expecting to see? A lot of individuals have presented data that those little fluctuations with exercise probably have very little to do with the physiological adaptations to exercise. You have other people that maybe think otherwise. I tend to be in the first camp. I think those little fluctuations probably have very little to do with our physiological adaptations, even chronically over time. So when we see something like this, where we're affecting testosterone levels, I don't know. I can't say, and neither can this data on whether or not that would have long-term implications for recovery with exercise. They just theoretically implicated that. Now, just food for thought here. Again, I can't draw any great conclusions here, but it is kind of cool to look at. Again, the qualities from 1995. I'm sorry if you're looking at this on a phone, but this is really interesting from the perspective of looking at what the response was like overnight. I didn't look in the methods to how they were able to get this all throughout the night, but it was probably interesting how they did that. But the uh, straight normal line is no exercise that the day before, sleep. And then there's a dashed line, which on cortisol, I'm kind of drawing it for you here, is the middle line here at the beginning. And this dotted line is the higher intensity. And you can see that definitely, especially at the very early stages of sleep, cortisol was increased a little bit with that lower intensity and much more with the higher intensity exercise. Was that because it was higher intensity or that it was relatively close to the time of sleep? Probably a little bit of both, because you can see that after several hours of sleep, everything pretty much comes back to normal and the response through the rest of the night is very much the same. I would have liked to see how the effect was throughout the rest of the morning, but they did not present that. Growth hormone is the same thing. You can see growth hormone, especially in the early stages of sleep, was decreased in the exercising groups very similarly, at least over time. Remember, it wasn't significant when you looked at the overall change at night, but there is some information out there showing the importance of the very early stages of sleep. So you get to sleep at a good period in time. Your growth hormone that's produced during those early stages is important for recovery. So if exercise, especially right before bed, is manipulating those early stages of growth hormone production, there could be implications for that. Again, this is all speculation. I don't have data to support that. But something that's interesting that I did hear, this was actually from a podcast. This is stating the importance of getting to bed at a good period in time. And yes, if you are a night owl, this is a problem for you, is that there's almost a window of opportunity based on your optimal circadian rhythm of when growth hormone will be produced. What that is, it's hard to say, right? But I think it was presented that for most individuals, that's kind of between 10, maybe even earlier than that, but maybe 10 p.m. and 11:30 p.m. That if you go to sleep at that time, you go to sleep during that optimal time, you're going to have that optimal growth hormone release. However, if you keep yourself up and you go past that 10, 10:30, 11, 11:30, midnight, 1 a.m., even if you go to bed and you stay asleep longer, like you just shift your sleep patterns more, you've still lost the opportunity for optimal growth hormone production at those early stages of sleep. And that's because we are actually quite a bit in tune with the day-night cycles that are presented. And you'll see some of that with the tips later on I have, and sort of helping you coordinate your physiological response to the light and dark cycles of night and day. So similarly, exercising before bed, there's some information that I did find on that. Idea, does exercise wake you up before you go to bed? Is anyone a nighttime person that likes to work out? Like, does anyone work out right before bed? There's no way I can't do it. It totally jacks me up. And Giovanni,
Yeah.
you work
I
out before bed?
definitely, I definitely don't work out, but I do sometimes do an intense like yoga session where my heart rate does come up a bit, but nothing to the degree of like I would consider a full workout.
That's an interesting mode of workout too, because you're also very much aware of your breathing, right? And your mental state. So that might also counteract a bit of the increase in heart rate that you might be having. I'm just curious, does anyone actually really like to work out before bed? They're just like, I love it. I conk out. Maybe I feel exhausted afterwards and I conk out.
I
Doesn't sound
sometimes do.
okay.
I sometimes do a really light workout, like maybe 30 to 45 minutes, right? Like after finishing all my schoolwork, I work out, take a bath, and then like go to bed. And I usually sleep pretty well, actually.
Interesting, very interesting. And I think, even though I don't have data to support it, because it's again not there, is this is really going to depend on each individual, right? And you actually might be surprised with some of the data that I do have here, is that data suggests that late night exercise or exercise before you go to bed really neither promotes nor impairs sleep. So Osborne, there you go. If it works for you, then that's probably fine. At least that's what some of this, it's not great data. And what were these people doing in this data? They were doing not that much different than what you just stated you were doing, but 30 minutes and they were working at 60 to 70% max heart rate, which is moderate. It's not super hard. And then they followed it up by 15 minutes of moderate intensity resistance exercise. So not really a super hard resistance training workout either, but it's kind of nice that they actually included both modes of working out. And that was done 2 hours before bedtime, followed by a shower and a small snack. And they really didn't find any implication on their sleep quality, which was quite interesting. Okay. I do want to mention, I kind of almost missed it here. Out of that, I think it was a study of 12 individuals. 2 of the individuals actually did have extreme impairment of sleep with their late night exercise. So 2 of the 12 people. So when you average the values, there was no difference, but they did note that 2 individuals did have extreme impairment of their sleep with late night exercise, really going back to, again, the individual differences between individuals. And even though data says there's nothing, if it wakes you up and it causes you to sleep poorly, then you're just going to have to do things differently. And that's really the case with all research kind of data. It's a great starting point, but there are definitely people that don't respond, normally. And we have to acknowledge that. Additional, here's another, and again, I really like these. If you don't like the data, I'm really sorry, but learn to kind of like it, because it really gives us an overview when we have, a short period in time like this to cover a topic. But this one's looking at the effects of evening exercise on sleep in healthy participants. So hopefully all of us here, another systematic review and meta-analysis. This was just one figure out of there. This is the one where there was a nice difference. Most of them showed, again, no real difference between exercising or not before sleep, but this one shows that there was a favorable response of exercise on increasing the time that you are in slow wave sleep at night. And that's the deep sleep that oftentimes people refer to as really, everything regenerating so that it's ready to go the next day. That deep sleep is a very important aspect of what we need at night. It's not a vast majority of the night. I think in general, it's, a couple hours, but in this particular aspect, and you can see that diamond's really only moving over to the right of 0 a little bit, meaning that there are mixed results. You can see some studies where it did not favor sleep. I keep mixing that up, favor exercise for sleep, but you have many that do on the right. And when you take them all together, there is a slight favor for exercise increasing slow wave sleep at night. And they did have another conclusion that I think is important for us to see. Overall, exercise performed in the evening does not seem to negatively affect sleep. In fact, they said rather the opposite, but just very small effects. So in other words, sleep actually might have some favorable responses for sleep. So if that's what you want to do, go ahead and do it. But again, I really think it comes down to the individual variation here and what works or does not work for you. So I had to go back actually pretty far again. I think this was on 2012. I was having problems finding good data on physiological effects of exercise on sleep, but this one was pretty good. And they have this nice figure here showing some possible acute effects on like the CNS system, body temperature, heart rate and heart rate variability, some acute but subsequent chronic effects like glucose metabolism, that growth hormone release that we already talked about, brain-derived neurotropic factor, BDNF stuff for the brain, but I'm not going to present on that one here, and some more chronic effects on sleep. So I'm just teasing out some of the ones here that I thought were really interesting. Acute and especially chronic exercise improves total sleep time, reduces your awake time at night, and increases slow wave sleep, similar to what I just presented on the previous slide. And a lot of that is from an effect on the central nervous system. So exercise is going to positively affect our ability to handle fatigue in the central nervous system. Body temperature, they speculated a lot here. There's not really a lot we know about body temperature, but surely you've heard a lot about sleeping in a cooler environment at night, and that seems to optimize sleep patterns. So what happens if we decide to exercise before bed? Your heart rate elevates, your temperature elevates. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, honestly, at first thought, I thought it would be a bad thing. But these articles discuss it's actually maybe a good thing that body temperature increases, because what you're then going to have is you're going to have an adjustment of that increase in body temperature when it's not needed anymore. The body's going to regulate it and it's going to start bringing it down. And that range now is much bigger. It's going from a higher body temperature than what you would have had without exercise. And it has to bring it down to this new, optimal level of body temperature for sleep. And they're saying that there's something about that. There's something about bringing it down a greater range that may improve sleep quality that you don't have when your body temperature starts a little lower. And I think the same could be true for a shower as well. Sometimes we shower before bed. Is increasing your temperature and a shower like that, again, might be a little bit counterintuitive. It was for me at first before I started reading into it, but it's more about, not starting at a cooler temperature, but it's about bringing that temperature down and allowing the body to sort of prepare for sleep through that preparation. It's a lot more that needs to be done on that, though. It's kind of interesting to think about, though. With heart rate and heart rate variability, exercise improves vagal modulation. And you guys probably know what that means, or at least I hope you know, but that's the parasympathetic control that allows us to, for instance, reduce our resting heart rate or reduce our nighttime heart rate. We're going to talk about technology monitoring of sleep towards the very end. And that's one thing that often those technologies use to help determine whether or not you had a good sleep last night was how low your heart rate got and how stabilized it was at night. And what exercise does is it helps actually with that parasympathetic control to lower that heart rate, not only throughout the day, but also at night. And what that also can do, believe it or not, is improve mood and therefore sleep. Heart rate variability is something that technologies use too, but it's not well studied. I was a little surprised. I was really excited to read more about heart rate variability and sleep, and it's not as well studied as I thought it was. I was asked to talk about the hormonal endocrine system, and unfortunately, again, little to no difference in growth hormone release at night with exercise, and that follows along with what the research showed after this particular one, which I already presented. Cortisol, there might be some improvement, but really not that much connection, it seems, with hormones and sleep, at least in regards to the exercise effects on hormones. And I did this quote because I think it says it better than I could. There is evidence that acute exercise provides immediate benefits for improved sleep. And that's nice for us to take home because some people are under the assumption that it takes a long time to achieve positive effects from exercise. And in certain variables like body composition, reductions in certain disease risks and that sort of thing, that might be true. But for sleep, it seems like there's some data that shows you can have very quick improvements in sleep, acute improvements in sleep, and that's really nice. And that if you keep that up, regular exercise leads to even greater subjective and objective benefits. This is really interesting now, listen, comparable to those produced by behavior therapy or pharmacotherapy for insomnia. So there's data that shows that exercise had just as a beneficial result on sleep quality than some forms of behavior therapy or pharmacotherapy for insomnia. That's pretty awesome. So you have people that are insomniacs, tell them to get out there and exercise. So here's some data on that mental health. I want to touch on mental health because it is kind of a hot topic these days, and we're paying attention to it. And exercise and sleep has an effect on that. Now, these look kind of complicated at the beginning, but they're not. And I don't usually like to present figures this small, but they really go together. So I put them all on here. Basically, this GDASS, I wasn't familiar with either, but this is looking at your overall negative emotions. Okay, overall negative emotions. It's just a survey that allows us to understand. So the higher the score, the more negative emotions that you have. Of course, we know what stress is, we know what anxiety is, and we know what depression is. Now, what did they look at? They grouped individuals into two categories, those that are healthy sleepers and those that are unhealthy sleepers. And again, they used that Pittsburgh quality survey to do that, and they had a cutoff. So you're a good sleeper, you're a bad sleeper. And the good sleeper is the dashed line, and the bad sleeper is the solid line here. So first off, just look at the difference between those two. You have the people that sleep badly have way more negative emotion than those that sleep well. They have more stress, they have more anxiety, and they have more depression. So sleep is obviously very, very important. Now let's look at the unhealthy sleepers and the effect of exercise. So we go from inactive to low amounts of physical activity to moderate to high. And look what happens very quickly, almost in all of them, some more than others. You can see a delayed effect with anxiety and stress, but a pretty fast effect on depression and overall negative emotion. As we add exercise in, that decreases, and it gets pretty close to being as low as those that don't sleep well, that do sleep well. So in other words, if you are someone that doesn't sleep well, if you want to increase your mental health, get out there and exercise. It can make up for some of the negative effects that you're having from poor sleep quality. So that's really, really important for us to look at as an outcome from this particular study. I was pretty amazed by that, to be perfectly honest. So it's pretty cool. But the other take home I have in my notes here that as a reminder, keeping a healthy sleep status could also help compensate psychological well-being for those who are physically inactive. So we don't like to think about that as exercise is medicine. But if you do have an individual that, for whatever reason, is inactive and is not going to be seeing themselves become active, if we can do other things outside of physical activity to get them to increase their sleep quality, you can see what happens here. I mean, even inactive, that is a huge jump in all 4 of these different aspects of mental health. Pretty powerful if you think about it. So either way you look at it, increasing exercise and or sleep, preferably both, are going to increase your mental health. I have a couple more slides that I'm going to hit on here, 3 slides here. I couldn't help but get excited when I saw an article specifically on resistance exercise and sleep. You guys all know I'm a big resistance exercise person. So what did it find out? Chronic resistance exercise improves subjective reports of sleep quality and quantity. Again, subjective. I feel better. I felt like I slept good. I feel good in the morning after sleeping. Those kind of measures of sleep. And there's something to say about that. That's really great. Acute resistance exercise and combined resistance exercise and aerobic activity, although there were some benefits there, definitely needs more research. It wasn't conclusive. And oddly enough, the data where individuals were including both aerobic exercise and resistance exercise showed an attenuation of some of the benefits. Kind of crazy, no real explanation for that. But it was interesting that those doing resistance exercise seemed to have more beneficial effects on sleep than those doing aerobic exercise and resistance exercise. Now, wipe that out of your mind for a second. There is some research showing us very nicely that if you do want positive effects from exercise, picking what you like to do is probably the best bet. If you like to do aerobic exercise, you're going to get many great health benefits from it. We also know, though, that if you like resistance exercise and maybe you dislike aerobic exercise, you're also going to have many great benefits by incorporating resistance exercise. So do what you like to do. However, for overall health effects, things like reduced mortality or reduced disease risk, so on and so forth, combining the two did have the best result, even though in this, the evidence is very bad here. I would not choose not to do aerobic exercise based on this. It's just a little interesting tidbit that I thought I would share with you. So keep in mind, all the different kinds of exercise are quite good for us. And of course, resistance exercise improves muscle strength and also neuropsychological outcomes, things like anxiety and depression, as we've already shown, and changing those. So muscle strength as well as anxiety and depression has some links to sleep disorders as well. So, these are kind of secondary measures that can affect sleep. And lastly, they presented that the more frequent that you're exercising with resistance exercise, the greater the intensity and the longer your resistance exercise sessions, all increase the amount of benefits that you're achieving. And they did have a couple figures, not that great. I'm not a big fan of these figures, but they do kind of get the point across. This is with intensity. And this is, they looked at many different studies on this. It was another systematic review. So this is combined effect, and they did it in the effect size. So you can see there's a greater effect on sleep quality as you have higher intensity exercise, and you have a greater increase in sleep quality when you are exercising with resistance exercise more frequently as well. So get out there and exercise at least 3 days per week and get some high intensity resistance exercise in there as well. To close out, as I've already lost some people, is general tips for better sleep. And I want to recommend a podcast out there. I'm not a big podcast person, but when I do work out, sometimes I do like to put one up there. And I really like the Huberman Lab. I think he's a very popular podcast. Maybe you've heard of him. He's from Stanford, presents on a wide variety of science topics, seems to be well prepared, very knowledgeable, and unbiased for the most part. I think we all have some amount of bias in there, but some podcasts I think are really biased, and I feel like he is not that biased. So maybe there is a little bit, but not enough to deter me from listening to him. I think he does a great job with it. And these are some tips that came from several of his podcasts that he's had on sleep. And there's a recommendation for morning sunlight. in the first for about 30 to 60 minutes after you awake. So basically you wake up, get outside, get some of that sunlight. That's going to optimize those cortisol levels. That's going to get them up more quickly, and it's going to help you feel like you're energized and ready to go at that point. Especially if you wake up, you feel a little groggy, just wake up, get up, and get outside. Exercising potentially earlier in the day is going to have a positive effect on sleep, as we've already seen in our talk today. Avoid fluorescent lights later in the evening, as I have light blasted in my face right now. And that's going to optimize natural melatonin secretion, which can help us regulate our sleep. This was interesting to me. This was new, but viewing light from the sunset. So as you have a sunset, not going out and staring at the sun during sunset, never do that, but getting some natural sunlight, like literally going outside, not just looking through a window, but go outside and just get some of that light in from the sunset, may help offset some of the negative effects of any bright light that you might have in the evening. That, it's really hard to eliminate light entirely. We can reduce it. And because of that, if we get out there and we get some of that sunset light, it'll help offset some of those negative impacts from having bright light before bed. Limit or eliminate caffeine intake after 2 p.m. That's had a great effect on my ability to increase my sleep quality, I will say. And this is another one that's worked for me. Guided meditation or breathing practice before bed may help relax you. It may help quiet the mind. I've always had a very active mind. And I've been doing specifically breathing practice right now before bed. That's really helped me have better sleep quality. And this is another one. I used to be bad with this. I used to prioritize getting stuff done, before bed and sacrificing my sleep schedule. But I'm really quite consistent now. I get to bed almost entirely every single day of the week between 10 o'clock and 11 o'clock, sometimes a little bit earlier than 10 o'clock. And I almost always wake up between 6 and 6:30 in the morning. And that works very well for me. And I feel better. I feel much better than when sometimes I'd stay up late working, or I'd force myself to wake up at 5 a.m. to get up and work. It's really helped to get a consistent schedule. So I really want to emphasize that. The last thing, it's my very last slide, is thoughts on technology for exercise and sleep. There are things called wearables. The first one there is the Oura Ring, which I have. I've been wearing one for, 2.5 years now. So I have data every day, minus a few periods where I didn't wear them. So when my son was born, I didn't want to know my sleep data at that point. But I have data for several years now, and it's been very insightful on how I'm keeping track of my sleep. And that's kind of pushed me to be more aware of it. There are other technologies out there like Whoop. There's a BioStrap here that I'm less familiar with. And looking at some of the research, wearables improve nighttime sleep quality in healthy subjects. So I'm proof of that from an individual basis. I believe that's really helped me. But there is some concern for accuracy of data sets. In other words, what my Oura Ring app is telling me, is that really good data? The answer is some of it is pretty good data, but in regards to interpreting your sleep stages, for instance, at night, I think the newest algorithm and the newest technology here with the Oura Ring, I think somewhere is somewhere around 70% accurate compared to standards of sleep plethysmography. And that's 70%. I mean, that's a C. I don't know if you think that's good or not, but some are as bad as like 50% or lower. And so that's definitely not good. With that being said, even though if it might say you're spending 2 hours in deep sleep, and in reality it's 1 hour, or maybe it's 2.5 hours, the thing is that these technologies are always on you, right? So you're getting pretty reliable data on, even though it might not be valid data, it's not really great at telling you how much deep sleep you're really getting, but at least it allows you to kind of compare on a night to night basis to give you some insight on what did I do today to really impact that so negatively? Oh yeah, I had a cup of tea, at 6 p.m. or I had a beer right before bed, or I stayed up really late, the night before. Whatever it is, you can sort of assess that. You can see that your deep sleep went down, even if it's not a true representation of your deep sleep. Relatively, it was changed in that way. And I think that's something to say for in regards to looking at, how your sleep quality is impacted with everything that you're doing. All right, it's 6:43. It's probably past what it should have been, but some people had to go, I see that, but I'm definitely open to listening to your thoughts, or if you have any questions. If you're good to go, that's fine too. I know it's in the evening and everyone wants to go and eat, but definitely open it up to you if you have any questions or even any comments you want to share about how you have positively impacted your sleep with or without exercise.
Hi, I have Gio on call right now. He wants something to say.
Sure. Hey, Gio.
Yeah, hi, Dr. Cotters. Yeah, I don't know what happened. My screen's frozen, and I don't want to end the meeting if I shut it out. So, because I had a couple little things to kind of go back on when you were talking about the first study with bikers. That made me think that maybe those studies like that is where the introduction of cool downs after a workout were introduced to kind of lighten the load of cortisol, maybe. I kind of want to get your kind of perspective on that as well, is how like the introduction of cool downs into a post-workout made it so that, well, one, injuries were lessened, but also just, I guess, overall stress of cortisol were also lessened.
That's a great question. And I just want to clarify for everyone here, anyone listening later, by cool down, you mean just by, for instance, continuing active movement following an exercise session in the way of active recovery to lower the heart rate, allow blood flow to redistribute appropriately, cardiovascular system recover, that sort of thing, correct?
Yes.
Okay. Yeah. Now, there are many areas out there that show cool down is quite necessary, not only for things like reducing risk of blood pooling in the legs, which is a cardiovascular issue, to active recovery and allowing us to be more prepared for our next bout of exercise at another time. That effect on cortisol, however, I don't know. I'm not familiar with any research. It could be out there that I haven't looked it up. I don't know if it has an effect on cortisol after exercise. So in other words, taking someone that does or does not do a cool down, does that affect cortisol? I don't have the data on that. My guess is that it might have a small impact, but I would also maybe guess that it probably doesn't have that much impact at all.
Mhm.
Now, by bringing that up, something to throw in the mix here of complicating things even further, but just by bringing up the idea of cool down, I started thinking about the trend these days of cold therapy. Ice baths are very popular. I have not done one myself, other than sometimes jumping in the ocean, very rarely. But I wonder how that might fit into the grand scheme of things too, on its effect on cortisol, because technically what they're trying to do over time is, by introducing that physiological stress to the body in a controlled manner, allows the body to better adapt to it. And you definitely for sure will see an increase in cortisol there. That's actually a test we do. I went to a salivary testing seminar where they teach us how to measure hormones in the saliva, and cortisol was one of them. And what they had us do to show that it actually worked was they had a big bin of ice water, and we took our salivary samples beforehand, and we stuck our arms in there, and I was very competitive. So it was me and this one postdoc girl that we decided at the same time that we were going to remove our arms at the same time, because enough was enough. But I was going to win that. And we looked at cortisol. Indeed, my cortisol spiked much higher than hers. She managed it much better, and that's pretty common for females versus males, as far as I know. But I'm even interested in how throwing that in might affect this whole idea of cortisol management. So I didn't quite answer your question because I don't know for sure, but it did bring up a really interesting thought about cold therapy and how that might interact too, and whether or not you do cold therapy after exercise sometime before bed, and how that affects your temperature and cortisol release would be really interesting to study.
Yeah, no, I think the same thing very much. And one other thing is, so about, I think 5 days a week, I have rowing practice at 6 a.m. So before my 9 a.m. classes. And I'm kind of wondering like why I'm so tired. Not only, I mean, I get enough sleep on most of those days, but I'm so tired during those classes. And I'm kind of wondering, like, since my cortisol spiked with the exercise, and then I'm going and sitting down and my heart rate lowers again, that's maybe a
maybe not a major factor, but definitely a factor in me struggling to stay awake in those classes.
Yeah, the first thing I would have said had you not have already given me the information is my first guess would be that the tired feeling that you have after that is a result of one of two things. One being chronic inadequate sleep. And it is possible you might feel you are getting adequate sleep, whereas in reality, you might not be. There are instances, this is attesting to the technology, for instance, where what this ring measures in my case, sometimes, actually, the first thing I do when I wake up is I open up the app because I'm curious, what my sleep score is. But I've noticed there's a discrepancy between what it tells me sometimes, how well I slept. It says, hey, you slept great. But I'm like, I feel tired. It's just, I woke up, I feel tired. And then other times it says, you slept like crap. And I feel great. So, it's really hard to tell how much sleep we actually need, especially based on subjective feelings, because I don't think that's an adequate marker necessarily. It's an important marker, but it's not an adequate marker for how much sleep we truly need. The other one that I was going to mention is you're probably working out very intensely with these rowing sessions, or at least at times you are, right? And so it's not surprising that you might feel a little tired afterwards. What is your nutrition though like? Are you following through with nutrition, or are you completely like depleting some of your carbohydrate stores with these intense sessions in the morning and then going right to class without proper nutritional recovery methods and that sort of thing? I don't know, that might play a part as well.
Yeah, no, I mean, usually I eat a few bananas, I get a bar in me, and then post class I eat about 1,300 calories immediately in one sitting.
That's pretty good.
Yeah, I definitely get enough nutrition. I eat around like 4,000 calories a day.
I commend you for that. It's not easy.
Definitely not. It's tough sitting through the meals sometimes, for sure. But yeah, that was kind of my only two questions slash perspectives on some of the things you talked about. I'll let Clinton kind of get off the phone with me here. I just want to say thank you again for coming to speak with us today. It was great.
Absolutely. Thanks. And I wish I had more like strong information to present, but it's a bit of an eye opener too. This was a bit more of a black box than I was expecting it to be when you threw this topic at me.
Yeah, no, I definitely know, like, especially when it comes to the mind or the brain and sleep, it's a big mystery. I mean, we see when people get brain traumas, they can speak another language or they can have an accent. So anything dealing with the brain is definitely a complicated topic. So I commend you for getting all the information that you did. I mean, I was highly interested in everything that you're saying. So I just want to say I appreciate it again.
Absolutely. And just to kind of, as we might be finishing up here is that's an amazing reminder that even though we have so much information and so much data and we've come so far, we've like got way further to go, not only on this topic, but in practically all of the health related topics that we're really interested in. I mean, there is so much to be done, so much data to collect, so much knowledge to gain, that what you guys are doing by, enhancing your knowledge, learning about all these other topics, and hopefully going out there and improving our knowledge somehow, or improving the application of that knowledge somehow, is really super important. So this was another reminder of that. But yeah, are there any other questions or comments that anyone wants to share on their experiences with sleep before we kind of wrap things up and go let Giovanni get to his 4,000 calorie? Yeah, Aaron.
I have one question, kind of sort of related to the presentation. Great presentation, by the way. Just on how, did you come across any data or literature related to napping? And if that may be beneficial for people even with good sleep, or if that could help people with poor sleep and hormone fluctuations?
Great question. The napping was not something I was specifically looking for, although I did come across one article on napping and I just glanced at it, but I remember reading it. And the reason I didn't include anything is because there was no beneficial effect on napping. And I think it was specifically in athletes. I don't remember. I think they were looking at some sort of recovery variables, although again, I just kind of glanced at it and I didn't have time to look at it because I spent a lot of time preparing for this today because again, I was learning about a lot of it. Now that was intriguing to me because I am a very consistent napper. I nap about 20 minutes every day, sometime usually I put my son down for a nap and I go take a 20-minute nap as well. And I just feel great. Even if I don't actually fall asleep at all, I just feel better, and then I can come back and get my work done. So subjectively, it feels better for me in that respect. I also think Dr. Huberman and his podcast, again, he has like 2 or 3, maybe more on sleep, and they're all really good. They're like 1 to 3 hours in length, so they're really long. But I did think he presented some data that shows some beneficial effects of napping. So even though I came across the one study, at least in athletes, it didn't seem to provide benefit for those variables. There does appear to be other research that shows some beneficial effects on napping. So until we find out what that directly is, if you feel good napping, continue napping. I don't think there's definitely any harm in napping, unless perhaps you do it too late in the day, right? 4, 5, 6 p.m. might be a problem. And for some people, if it's too long, and maybe you've had the experience like I have, maybe I meant to set an alarm and I didn't, and I slept for an hour instead of 20 minutes. I actually don't feel good after that long of a nap. Alexa, 3 hour, you sound like my wife. Yeah, 3-hour nap. I don't think I'd be able to sleep at night if I take a 3-hour nap. So I can't say it's bad for you, but I think anecdotally, for myself at least, I think too long of a nap might have a potential problem. But napping research would be interesting to look into. I would like to look into it further as well. It's a great question, Aaron. Are you a napper? I'm just curious.
Yeah, I took a nap earlier today, so it
And you
felt pretty
like,
good.
if you feel good? How long?
3 hours.
3 hours. Is that why Alexa brought that up? 3-hour nap?
No, but
Goodness.
unrelated. But just
Okay, you don't do
had
that
to
every
be-
day, do you?
No, I was just for some. I think I didn't get too much sleep last night, so maybe kind of compensated. Normally it's like 20 to 30 minutes, every so often, but today was a bit longer. But it felt good. We'll see how I sleep tonight, though. But
Now, I think there is some evidence out there. Again, I think it was from this podcast from Dr. Huberman, who was talking to a sleep specialist, and they were having a bit of a discussion about, I think this was more along the lines of, morning sleep and when to wake up. But I think they were applying it to naps as well. But for instance, the question was like, do I consistently wake myself up at 8 o'clock? But if I do that with an alarm, if I would compare that to not setting an alarm, and I would naturally sleep until 9 or 10 o'clock, is that okay? And I believe the response was yes. I mean, if your body needs to catch up, and I think that's the case for a lot of people, right? They're accumulating sleep debt night after night, week after week, month after month, for who knows how long. And the body can have times where it plays catch up when the opportunity is there. And that sleep specialist, I believe, said there's nothing wrong with that. So if you do have the opportunity to kind of sleep in naturally, not force yourself to wake up. I have an alarm, but I'm almost always up. It's a very odd, almost consistently 1 to 5 minutes before my alarm goes off. I'm always naturally waking up. It's really crazy. So there's nothing wrong with that. And I think that was applied to naps too. So, if the case comes and you need to take a little bit of a longer nap, there's nothing wrong with that. But I think over time, 3-hour naps every day might pose a problem just in a productive standpoint for you getting everything done that you need to get done. It's cool for my son, who's almost 4 years old, but college students especially, maybe not. But I'm glad you got caught up. Just wanted to share that, though. Definitely want to recommend those podcasts for anyone that's interested to just listen while they're driving. They've been very informative for me as well.
You share the name of the podcast, Dr. Cotter?
Yeah, his name is Dr. Huberman. I'll write it in the chat. Dr. Huberman. He does them on YouTube, I believe. So it's actually, you can see the faces and all of that. Sometimes he does solo ones. Like, for instance, he did a very long one on fertility and pregnancy and women's health and all that. That was very, very interesting. And that was solo. But again, I think he just spends that's not his thing. But he did a large amount of research for it and presents it in a very, very nice way. And he's talked to experts on it too, but he has kind of specials on certain areas like that. There are a few on like exercise performance or various health outcomes that might be interesting to those here as well. Just an overall pretty good scientific focused podcast that again seems very unbiased, at least from my view on it, and that's something to consider too. Remember, there's always, I don't know, like he gave one on alcohol that I thought was a very good podcast, for instance. I almost felt like he was just slightly inside. He feels that, and you know, the research is pretty good on it too, that alcohol is not good for you. It's poisonous, right? And he was kind of open that, you know, if you want to drink here and there, that's fine. But just hearing him talk, I could tell he felt very strongly that no, you should not drink. And that's fine. It's a very, very slight bias that he was presenting. But, you know, things like that are all things that you should be aware of when you're listening to speakers. You know, listening to me today, you might think I might have a bias of some sort. That's important to consider sometimes. You know, we're humans. It's easy to be biased, even unconsciously. But I keep rambling. Dr. Huberman, I think, is an excellent podcast where there is very little, and in fact, in many cases, probably no bias at all. But check him out. He's a professor. All right. Well, it is 7. I'm more than happy to answer more questions, but I'll kindly ask you to do so by emailing me, which I think, you know, being that you're on campus, you guys can all find that out, but I'll put that in the chat anyways. Joshua.Cotter, if you're listening, more than happy to do that. We can even chit chat if you'd like to about it. It's an interesting topic. Thanks again for having me here, and start toning it down, turn out those fluorescent lights, don't eat too big of a meal before bed, and get ready to have an awesome night's sleep tonight. Exercise if you like. Thanks, everyone. Have a good night.
Good, Dr. Cotter.